The wind, a restless spirit, whispered through the pines encircling Kenji's small cottage, its voice a familiar solace in the vast quietude of the mountain. For 20 years, this wind had been his most constant companion. It sighs and rushes the rhythm of his days, more telling than any timepiece. Kenji, a man carved from the silence and the ancient wood he worked, moved with the deliberate grace of a stream flowing over smooth stones. His mornings began before the sun, with the ritual of cool water on his face, the taste of plain rice, and the soft scrape of his worn sandals on the packed earth floor. He was a simple charcoal burner, his life a cycle of felling, stacking, burning, and hauling. Each action performed with a meditative precision that left no room for wasted movement or thought. The forest was his temple, the rustling leaves his scripture, the scent of burning oak his incense. He had come to this isolated perch on the slopes of Mount Ibuki, seeking nothing but the profound emptiness that had eventually bloomed into a quiet contentment, a hard-won peace after a youth he never spoke of, a time when the clang of steel and the cries of men had been a sound as common as the cawing of crows. Now, the only steel he knew was the bite of his axe, the keen edge of his carving knife, shaping small wooden animals for children in the distant village he visited but twice a season. His world was small, bounded by the reach of his shadow and the arc of the sun, yet within it he had found a universe. He had learned the language of the shifting shadows, the subtle change in the cicada's song that heralded rain, the way the mist clung to the valleys like a shroud of forgotten sorrows. Today, however, the wind carried a different note, a thread of urgency, a faint tremor that disturbed the deep stillness of his soul. He paused, axe resting on a half-split log, his head tilted, listening beyond the trees. It was not the sound of deer, nor the grunt of a wild boar. It was something human, yet furtive, desperate. He had seen few travelers on this path, fewer still who climbed this high without purpose. The lines around his eyes, etched by sun and smoke, deepened. He resumed his work, but a part of his awareness remained attuned to the forest's unsettled breath. The sun climbed, a burnished disk in the hazy sky, and the heat began to press down, drawing out the resinous perfume of the pines. It was then, as he wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, that he saw her. A small figure, little more than a child, stumbling from the dense undergrowth at the edge of his clearing, her clothes torn, her face pale and smudged with dirt and tears. She moved like a startled fawn, one hand clutching a bundle wrapped in faded cloth, the other outstretched, as if to ward off unseen phantoms. She took a few more faltering steps, then her legs seemed to give way, and she crumpled to the ground, a small, broken doll amidst the wild grasses. Kenji moved, not with haste, but with the steady, measured pace that defined him. He laid his axe carefully against the woodpile, his gaze never leaving the girl. As he approached, he saw the fine silk of her inner kimono, now stained and ripped, peeking from beneath a coarser outer garment. This was no peasant child lost from a nearby village. There was a delicacy to her features, even beneath the grime, a refinement that spoke of a different world. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her. Her eyes fluttered open, wide and dark, with a terror that seemed too large for her small frame. She tried to scramble back, a choked whimper escaping her lips. "Be still, child," Kenji said, his voice rough from disuse, but gentle, like the rasp of dry leaves. "You are safe here." Safety. The word seemed an alien concept in the stark fear that radiated from her. He offered no further platitudes, knowing that terror had its own language, one that reason could not easily penetrate. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the tremor in her limbs. Slowly, carefully, he reached out, not to touch her, but to indicate the small stream that trickled nearby. "Water," he said. "Rest." He rose and went to his cottage, his movements unhurried, giving her space. He returned with a wooden cup of cool water and a small, damp cloth. She watched him, wary as a cornered animal, but the thirst in her eyes was undeniable. He placed the cup on the ground near her and stepped back. After a long moment, her small hand darted out, snatching the cup. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. He waited, his expression unreadable, a mask of stoic calm. When she had finished, he gestured to the cloth. She hesitated, then took it, dabbing tentatively at her face. The simple act seemed to drain her last reserves of strength. Her shoulders slumped. Kenji knew a choice lay before him, as clear and sharp as the edge of his blade. To take her in was to invite the storm that was surely pursuing her. His peace, so arduously cultivated, would be shattered. His solitude, his shield against a world he had renounced, would be breached. Yet, to turn her away, to cast this frightened wisp of a girl back into the maw of whatever hunted her, was a betrayal of a deeper, unspoken code that resided in the marrow of his bones, a residue of an honor he thought he had buried long ago. He looked at the sun, now past its zenith. Shadows were beginning to lengthen, painting the forest floor in shades of gray. The wind sighed again, a mournful, knowing sound. He thought of the hawks that sometimes circled his valley, their fierce, lonely cries echoing the desolation of a life lived on the edge. Was this child not like one of them, harried from her nest, pursued by a relentless fate? His own past, a carefully walled-off garden of regret and resignation, stirred within him. He had once failed to protect, had once stood by while injustice unfurled its dark banner. The memory was a cold stone in his gut. He would not fail again, not if the choice was his to make, however small, however insignificant his stand in the grand, indifferent turning of the world. He picked up her small bundle, which had fallen beside her. It was surprisingly light. "Come," he said, his voice still quiet, but imbued with a new resolve. "The sun will soon set. My home is poor, but it is sheltered from the night." The girl stared at him, her eyes searching his face, perhaps finding something there beyond the rough exterior, a flicker of shared sorrow, an echo of resolute strength. Slowly, hesitantly, she pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly. He did not offer a hand, sensing her need to find her own strength, however fragile. He turned and walked towards his cottage, the small, sturdy structure of wood and thatch that had been his refuge for 2 decades. He did not look back to see if she followed, but he heard the soft fall of her lighter steps on the path behind him, a hesitant counterpoint to his own. The wind rustled the prayer flags he had strung between 2 ancient pines, their faded colors a silent testament to unspoken hopes. As he crossed the threshold into the cool dimness of his single room, he knew that the world, with all its turmoil and its sorrow, had found him once more. The illusion of his impenetrable sanctuary had vanished like morning mist. He had sheltered a Ronin's daughter, he was almost certain of it, though no words had been spoken to confirm this, only the instinct that resonated from her fear and the subtle signs of her breeding. And with that act, he had invited the wolves to his door. The night would be long, and the dawn, he suspected, would bring a reckoning far greater than any he had faced in his solitary years on the mountain. Yet, as he kindled a small fire in the central hearth, the familiar ritual grounding him, a strange sense of purpose, stark and clear, settled over him, as definite as the fall of his axe on seasoned oak. The choice had been made. The path, though fraught with peril, was now set. The stoic mask of the charcoal burner remained, but beneath it, something long dormant had begun to stir, an ember of defiance fanned by the desperate flight of a child. The small cottage, usually a haven of profound silence, broken only by the crackle of the hearth or the whisper of Kenji's tools against wood, now held a new, palpable tension. It was the silence of a held breath, of unspoken fears and looming uncertainties. Hana, for that was the name she had finally whispered when Kenji had offered her a bowl of warm millet porridge, sat huddled near the fire, wrapped in one of his old patched robes. It dwarfed her small frame, yet she clutched it around herself as if it were armor. Her eyes, large and dark, followed Kenji's every movement as he went about his evening rituals, securing the wooden shutter, checking the water barrel, laying out his simple sleeping mat on the far side of the small room. He moved with an economy of motion, his presence filling the space, not with threat, but with a quiet, grounding solidity. He did not press her for information, understanding that her story, like a wounded bird, would emerge only when it felt safe enough. Instead, he spoke occasionally, his words simple, matter-of-fact, describing the sounds of the night forest, the hoot of an owl, the distant bark of a fox, as if to familiarize her with this new, temporary world, to weave a fragile web of normalcy around the raw edges of her terror. He showed her the small wooden figures he carved, a stern-faced badger, a playful otter, a crane poised for flight. Her fingers, small and trembling, traced the smooth lines of the crane, a flicker of something other than fear in her eyes for a fleeting moment. "My father," she began, her voice barely audible, a thread of sound almost lost in the sigh of the wind outside. "He carved birds too, eagles, hawks." He said they understood freedom. Kenji merely nodded, stoking the fire. The mention of her father hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief and peril. He knew, with a certainty that needed no confirmation, that her father was the Ronin whose flight had brought this storm upon her. A man of skill, then, if he carved eagles, a man who valued freedom, and likely a man who had made powerful enemies. The child's presence was a testament to that. Later, as the fire burned low and the shadows danced like specters on the earthen walls, Hana spoke again, her words fragmented, images surfacing from the depths of her ordeal. She spoke of men in dark armor, of shouting, of running through endless forests, of her mother's last, desperate command to flee and not look back. She did not speak of her father directly, only of his absence, a void that seemed to swallow all other memories. Kenji listened, his face impassive, but his heart, long stilled by solitude, felt a dull ache. He had seen the brutality of men in armor, understood the cold calculus of pursuit. The world had not changed so much then, since he had turned his back on it. The strong still preyed on the weak, and innocence was a fragile shield against the ambitions of powerful men. He thought of the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, which he had once tried to understand, to follow. It spoke of honor, of loyalty, of compassion. Yet, how often was it twisted, used as a justification for cruelty, for the blind obedience that crushed the spirit and spilled innocent blood? The Ronin, her father, had he been a man of true honor, or one who had lost his way? The answer mattered little now, not when measured against the terrified sobs that shook the small girl huddled by his fire. His duty, as he saw it now, was not to judge the father, but to protect the child. This was a simpler code, one written not in scrolls, but in the fundamental empathy that bound all living things. As the first hint of gray began to dilute the deep indigo of the night sky, Hana finally succumbed to exhaustion, her small body curling into itself on the pallet he had made for her. Kenji watched her for a long moment, the lines of worry on his face softened by a profound sense of pity. He rose silently and stepped outside. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. A lone star still lingered in the western sky, a diamond spark against the fading night. He looked towards the east, where the peaks of the distant mountains were beginning to emerge as dark silhouettes against the approaching dawn. The day would bring what it would. He felt no fear, only a heavy resignation, a sense of inevitability. He had lived his life simply, honestly, for 2 decades. If this was to be his last day, then he would meet it, as he had met all others, with quiet dignity and an unwavering resolve. He performed his morning ablutions by the stream, the cold water, a shock that cleared his mind. He did not reach for his axe, not yet. There was no pretense that he could fight what was coming. His strength lay not in arms, but in the conviction of his heart. He was a charcoal burner, a simple man. What could one such man do against the tide of violence that was surely rolling towards his small sanctuary? He could stand. He could be a shield, however frail. He could offer one small act of defiance against the darkness. He returned to the cottage. Hana was still asleep, her breathing shallow but even. A stray lock of dark hair had fallen across her forehead, and he resisted the urge to brush it away. Such tenderness was a luxury he could ill afford. Instead, he began to prepare for the day, his movements precise, economical. He laid out a clean, though patched tunic for himself. He checked the small store of rice, the water. Mundane tasks, yet they anchored him, kept the encroaching dread at bay. He thought of the 70 samurai mentioned in the old tales, the loyal retainers, the symbols of unwavering fealty. But fealty to whom? To what? To a lord, to a code, to an abstract concept of honor that could so easily kirk, and the wind, which had been a restless whisper throughout the night, seemed to hold its breath, creating an unnatural stillness that amplified the distant, almost imperceptible sounds that Kenji's ears, honed by years of solitude, began to pick up. It was not the furtive padding of a fox, nor the rustle of a boar in the undergrowth. It was the rhythmic, disciplined tread of many feet, the faint clink of metal, the subtle creak of leather. They were coming. He had known they would, yet the confirmation sent a cold shiver, not of fear, but of stark reality, down his spine. The sun was not yet fully risen, its pale light just beginning to filter through the dense canopy, painting the forest floor in mottled shades of gray and gold. It would be a beautiful dawn, he thought, with a touch of irony, a serene stage for what was likely to be a brutal drama. He did not wake Hana. Let her have these last few moments of oblivion, of peace, however fragile. He stepped outside his cottage, his worn sandals making little sound on the dewy earth. He stood straight, his gaze fixed on the narrow track that led down the mountainside, the only viable approach to his secluded dwelling. His hands were empty, clasped loosely behind his back. He was not a warrior preparing for battle. He was a man preparing to meet his fate, a simple charcoal burner who had chosen to draw a line in the dirt with his own life. The sounds grew clearer now, closer. He could discern the cadence of disciplined marchers, the occasional gruff command, the metallic whisper of swords in their scabbards. They moved with purpose, with the efficiency of men accustomed to such grim errands. He wondered briefly about the Ronin, Hana's father. What crime had he committed to warrant such a determined pursuit? Was he a traitor, a murderer, or merely a man who had chosen the wrong side in some distant feudal squabble? The answer, Kenji knew, would likely be presented to him soon, painted in the stark colors of accusation and justification by those who now approached, but it would not change his own resolve. The child's innocence was the only truth that mattered to him in this moment. The forest around him seemed to grow unnaturally quiet, the birdsong stilled, the insects silent, as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation. Only the wind, now picking up slightly, rustled the leaves of the tall pines, a sound like 1,000 hushed whispers, perhaps of warning, perhaps of sorrow. Then they appeared. Not all at once, but as a slow, inexorable tide of dark figures emerging from the gloom of the lower path. First, a pair of scouts, their movements wary, their eyes scanning the clearing. Then, the main body, a column of samurai, their armor a somber black and gray, their clanmon visible on their breastplates, a stylized hawk, he noted. The same bird Hana's father had favored in his carvings. There was a grim irony in that. They moved with a terrifying precision, fanning out to surround the small clearing, their swords still sheathed but their hands resting on the hilts, a silent promise of deadly force. Kenji counted them, not out of tactical assessment, but with a kind of detached curiosity. 10, 20, 50, more. They seemed an endless river of steel and grim purpose. 70. The number resonated in his mind, an almost mythical count, signifying an overwhelming and absolute commitment of force for what seemed, on the surface, to be the retrieval of one small girl from the care of one old man. The leader, a man of imposing stature, his helmet adorned with stark, antler-like horns, moved to the front. His armor was finer than the others, his gaze, even from this distance, sharp and commanding. He stopped a dozen paces from Kenji, his men forming a silent, menacing semicircle. The air crackled with unspoken threat. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the sigh of the wind and the faint jingle of armor. Kenji met the leader's gaze, his own expression calm, unyielding. He would not show fear. He would not show defiance. He would simply be. The samurai leader, whose name Kenji would later learn was Captain Oda, surveyed the solitary figure before him with an unblinking gaze. Oda's face, framed by the stark lines of his kabuto, was weathered and hard, a mask of stern authority. He saw not a warrior, not a threat, but a simple peasant, an obstacle perhaps, but one easily brushed aside. Yet, there was something in the old man's stillness, in the quiet dignity of his stance, that gave him a moment's pause. It was not defiance, not exactly, but a profound rootedness, like an ancient tree that had weathered countless storms. Oda's voice, when he finally spoke, was rough, accustomed to command, devoid of any conciliatory tone. "Old man," he began, the words sharp as a blade in the crisp morning air, "you shelter a fugitive, the daughter of the Ronin Masamune, a traitor to his lord, a man who has spilled honorable blood. Hand her over, and you may yet see another sunrise." His words hung heavy, an ultimatum dressed as a grim courtesy. The 70 samurai behind him remained motionless, a wall of silent, disciplined menace, their presence a crushing weight on the small clearing. Kenji's gaze did not waver. He had expected this, the accusation, the demand. He took a slow breath, the scent of pine and damp earth filling his lungs, a reminder of the life he was risking, the simple beauty he was defending in his own small way. "The girl is a child," Kenji replied, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the stillness. "She has done no wrong. She sought shelter. I gave it." He spoke the truth as he knew it, a simple, unadorned statement. There was no plea in his voice, no attempt to negotiate. Oda's lip curled in a sneer, though it was hard to tell beneath the shadow of his helmet. "Wrong? Her father is Masamune Kinemon, once a respected samurai of the Akamatsu clan, now a masterless dog who betrayed his daimyo, Lord Harima, cutting down his own comrades in a fit of misguided rebellion. He fled, abandoning his duty, his honor. His family shares in his disgrace. The girl is a seed of that same poisoned tree. By the law of the shogun, by the code of the samurai, she is forfeit." The captain's words were a recitation of charges, a justification for the armed force that now surrounded Kenji's humble abode. Bushido, the warrior's code, was invoked. A shield for their actions, a sword against any who might question them. Kenji understood the bleak logic of their world, a world he had long ago forsaken. A world where loyalty to a lord trumped all other considerations, where the sins of the father were indeed visited upon the children, where compassion was often seen as a weakness. "A seed may be poisoned by the soil it is planted in," Kenji said, his gaze steady. "Or it may grow true if given clean earth and sunlight. She is but a sapling, knowing only fear. What honor is there in crushing such a thing?" He was not arguing law or lineage. He was speaking of something more fundamental, a truth that resonated in the quiet depths of his own spirit. A faint murmur went through the ranks of the samurai, quickly suppressed. Perhaps some of them had children of their own. Perhaps some, in a hidden corner of their warrior hearts, felt a flicker of unease at the captain's unyielding stance towards a mere child. But discipline was paramount. Their faces remained impassive masks. Oda, however, seemed unmoved, or perhaps he merely hardened his resolve, against any nascent sentimentality. "Honor, old man," Oda spat, "lies in duty. My duty is to my lord and to the shogun." Masamune defied his lord, broke his oaths. He is an outlaw. His daughter is a tool, a means to draw him out, or a symbol to deter others who might contemplate such treason. Her fate is not your concern. He shifted his weight, his hand resting more firmly on the hilt of his katana. The gesture was not lost on Kenji. The time for words was drawing to a close. "My concern?" Kenji stated, his voice still low but imbued with an unshakable conviction, "is for any soul that seeks refuge at my door from cruelty and injustice. This has always been my way, long before your lord or his codes came to this mountain." He spoke not of Bushido, but of a more ancient personal law, the law of basic human decency, of hospitality, of protecting the vulnerable. It was a simple creed, yet in this moment, it felt as profound and unyielding as the mountain itself. Oda scoffed. "Your way? An old man's foolish sentimentality. It will lead you only to a swift death. This is your final warning. Step aside. Give us the girl." The air grew colder, the tension stretching taut, like a bowstring pulled to its limit. Kenji could feel the 70 pairs of eyes fixed upon him, could sense the coiled readiness of the warriors, their training, their discipline, all honed for this moment of confrontation, however unequal. He thought of Hana, asleep inside the cottage, oblivious to the storm that had broken around her fragile sanctuary. He had promised her safety, a promise he knew he likely could not keep in the face of such overwhelming odds, but he could keep his word to himself, to the silent code that had guided his solitary life. He could stand between her and them, a frail barrier perhaps, but a barrier nonetheless. He looked past Oda, towards the distant peaks now kissed by the full light of the rising sun. The wind whispered through the pines, a mournful song, a lament for what was to come. He did not speak. His silence was his answer. It was a silence that spoke of resolve, of a peace found not in surrender, but in the acceptance of one's fate, when aligned with one's deepest principles. He would not step aside. He would not betray the trust of a terrified child. He would not forsake his own quiet honor, forged in the crucible of solitude and reflection. This small clearing, this humble cottage, had become his final dojo, the place where his life's philosophy would be tested not by kata or koan, but by the stark reality of imminent violence. The choice had been made long ago, when he first saw the girl, when he first chose compassion over self-preservation. Now, all that remained was to see it through, to its inevitable tragic end. The moral dilemma for Oda was perhaps less profound. His was the certainty of orders, the weight of a system designed to crush dissent. Yet, even in his hardened eyes, Kenji thought he saw a flicker of something. Respect? Annoyance at this unexpected delay? Or perhaps just the cold calculation of a predator about to strike? The philosophical tension hung heavy, an unanswered question poised on the razor edge of a drawn sword. What was true honor? Unthinking obedience to a flawed master, or the courage to defend the innocent even at the cost of one's own life? For Kenji, the answer was as clear as the mountain air. The silence stretched, taut and brittle, the world seeming to shrink to the space between Kenji and Captain Oda. The wind, which had been a mournful sigh, now seemed to hold its breath, mirroring the unnatural stillness of the 70 samurai. Oda's face, impassive beneath the grim lines of his helmet, betrayed no inner conflict, only the implacable will of a commander whose orders were to be obeyed without question. Yet, Kenji sensed, or perhaps hoped, that even within that ironclad duty, a sliver of human recognition for his stand might exist. But it would not, could not, alter the captain's course. The machinery of power, once set in motion, was a relentless force. "So be it, old fool." Oda finally rasped, his voice devoid of any further attempts at persuasion, flat with the finality of judgment. "You have chosen your fate. You will die for a traitor's whelp." He made a subtle gesture with his hand, a signal to his men. There was no dramatic flourish, no shouted command, just the chilling efficiency of disciplined warriors preparing to act. The samurai shifted, their stances widening slightly, their hands gripping their sword hilts with a new, lethal intent. The subtle click of Suba against Saya, the metallic whisper of blades being eased a fraction from their scabbards, were the only sounds that broke the profound quiet. They were not preparing for a duel, they were preparing for an execution, an overwhelming display of force to crush a single, unarmed man. Kenji did not flinch. His gaze remained steady, fixed on Oda, but his awareness encompassed the entire clearing, the ring of hostile steel that encircled him. He thought of Hana, still asleep inside the cottage, her innocent dreams undisturbed, for now. A pang of sorrow, sharp and deep, pierced through his stoic resolve. He could not save her, not in the way the world understood salvation, but perhaps, in some small, immeasurable way, his stand would mean something. Perhaps it would plant a seed in her memory, a testament that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, one small light could dare to shine. He slowly, deliberately, raised his hands, palms open, in a gesture not of surrender, but of peace, of finality. It was the movement of a man who had made his peace with the world, with himself. "I have lived my life," Kenji said, his voice calm, carrying a resonance that seemed to surprise even himself. "It has been a simple life, but it has been mine. If it ends today, defending a child from needless cruelty, then it is an ending I can meet without shame." His words were not for Oda, nor for the samurai. They were for himself, for the rustling pines, for the listening mountain, a final affirmation of the path he had chosen. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the familiar landscape, the tall trees that had been his silent companions, the distant peaks that had witnessed his solitary struggles and his quiet joys. A single cherry blossom petal, unseasonably late, or perhaps carried on an errant breeze from some sheltered grove, drifted down, landing softly on his worn tunic. A fleeting moment of beauty, poignant and fragile, in the face of imminent brutality. Oda's patience, if he ever possessed any for such defiance, was clearly at an end. "Enough of this peasant philosophizing," he snarled. "Take him, and fetch the girl. Be quick about it. We have wasted too much time on this stubborn fool." Two samurai, their faces grim, detached from their task by years of brutal conditioning, stepped forward, their swords now fully drawn, the polished steel gleaming coldly in the morning light. They moved with a swift, practiced efficiency, intending to dispatch him quickly, to end this inconvenient delay. Kenji did not attempt to flee, nor did he offer any futile resistance. He simply stood his ground, his body a frail shield before the door of his cottage. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in fear, but in a final, silent communion with the spirit of the mountain, with the essence of the life he was about to relinquish. He thought of the sound of his axe splitting wood, the warmth of the sun on his face, the taste of clean water from the stream, the quiet satisfaction of a day's honest labor. Simple things, profound things. As the two samurai lunged, their blades arcing towards him, Kenji did not see them. Instead, in his mind's eye, he saw Hana's face, her eyes wide with terror when she had first stumbled into his clearing. He had offered her sanctuary. He would not, could not, withdraw that offer now, even as his life was forfeit. His final act was not one of aggression, but of unwavering presence. He remained rooted to the spot, a silent testament to his conviction. The impact, when it came, was less a sharp pain than a profound, jarring shock, a brutal tearing of the veil between worlds. He felt a searing heat in his chest, then a spreading coldness. His knees buckled. He did not cry out. The only sound was a soft sigh, like the wind escaping through a crack in an old wall. He fell, not backward into the cottage, but forward, onto the earth he had tended for so long, his lifeblood staining the soil that had sustained him. From inside the cottage, awakened by the sharp commands and the sudden violent sounds, Hana, hidden in the small root cellar Kenji had shown her, a place smelling of damp earth and stored tubers. Heard the muffled thud of his body falling. She clamped her hands over her mouth to stifle a scream, tears streaming down her face. She had heard his calm voice, then the harsh, angry tones of the samurai leader, and then this terrible, final silence, broken only by the heavy tread of boots outside. Terror, cold and absolute, washed over her. The man who had shown her kindness, the quiet, gentle man who had offered her porridge and a warm robe, was gone. She was alone again, hunted, with the wolves now inside the fold. Through a tiny crack in the ill-fitting cellar door, she saw a sliver of the scene. The dark forms of the samurai, the glint of steel, and a glimpse of Kenji's worn sandals. Still, so terribly still, on the ground. The world had become a nightmare, a place of relentless cruelty, where the only kindness she had known in days had been extinguished with brutal finality. The mountain wind, which had earlier seemed to hold its breath, now gusted through the clearing, swirling dust and fallen leaves around the silent, armored figures and the fallen form of the charcoal burner. It was a lament, a sigh of nature itself for a good man lost, for a small, defiant light, snuffed out by the overwhelming darkness. The samurai showed no emotion as Kenji fell, his life spilling onto the packed earth of his small clearing. For them, it was merely the conclusion of a necessary, if slightly irritating task. Captain Oda stepped forward, his gaze briefly falling on the still form of the charcoal burner before dismissing him entirely. The old man had been a fool, an inconsequential speck of resistance against the might of Lord Harima and the authority of the shogunate. Such sentimentality was a disease, and it had met its inevitable cure. "Find the girl," Oda commanded, his voice cutting through the sudden heavy silence that had descended upon the clearing, a silence broken only by the mournful soughing of the wind through the pines. "Search the hovel. She cannot have gone far." Several samurai, sheathing their bloodied swords with practiced indifference, moved towards the small cottage. Their heavy footsteps on the wooden floorboards echoed ominously. Inside, Hana, crouched in the cramped, earthen darkness of the root cellar, pressed herself further against the damp wall, her small body trembling uncontrollably. She could hear them moving above, their voices gruff, the sounds of objects being overturned, the clatter of pottery. Each sound was a hammer blow against her fragile composure. The memory of Kenji's gentle eyes, his quiet strength, was a fresh wound, a stark contrast to the brutality that now filled his home. He had died for her. The realization was a leaden weight in her chest, a terrible burden for a child to bear. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking from beneath her lids, praying to any gods that might listen, though her faith, like her hope, was rapidly dwindling. One of the samurai, a burly man with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, noticed the slightly dislodged wooden planks that formed the cellar door, almost hidden beneath a pile of old sacks. "Ho, Captain," he called out. "There's a space beneath the floor here." Oda strode to the cottage entrance, his expression impatient. "Then open it. Do not dally," the samurai grunted, prizing the planks open with the butt of his spear. A sliver of light pierced the darkness of the cellar, falling directly on Hana's terrified face. She flinched, whimpering softly, like a trapped animal. The samurai peered in, his face shadowed. Well, what have we here? A little rat in its nest." He reached down, his calloused hand grabbing her arm roughly, and hauled her out of the cellar. She stumbled into the relative brightness of the cottage, blinking, her clothes covered in dirt, her face streaked with tears and grime. She was small, frail, her eyes wide with a terror that might have moved a different kind of man. But these were warriors hardened by years of conflict, their hearts calloused against pity, especially for the kin of a perceived enemy. The samurai dragged her outside, into the clearing where Kenji's body still lay, a stark reminder of the price of defiance. Hana's gaze was drawn irresistibly to him. She saw the dark stain spreading on his simple tunic, the unnatural stillness of his limbs. A choked sob escaped her, raw and heartbroken. Captain Oda looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He saw not a child, but a piece of a puzzle, a pawn in a larger game. "Masamune's daughter, I presume," he stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "You have caused a great deal of trouble, girl." "And cost an old fool his life." Hana wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice, to tell them that Kenji was no fool, that he was braver and more honorable than any of them. But fear and grief had stolen her voice. She could only stare at Oda, her small face a mask of silent accusation and despair. Oda turned to his men. "Secure her. We ride within the hour. The journey back to Lord Harima's estate is long." 2 samurai moved to bind Hana's wrists with a rough rope, their touch impersonal, efficient. She did not resist, her small store of courage utterly depleted. As they tied her, her gaze fell upon the small bundle she had carried, the one Kenji had placed carefully inside the cottage. It lay forgotten near the hearth. Inside, it was a single object, a small, exquisitely carved wooden hawk, its wings outstretched in a silent scream of freedom, the last gift from her father. Now, both her father's legacy and Kenji's sacrifice seemed to mock her. What was freedom, if it led only to pursuit and death? What was courage, if it was so easily crushed? The samurai began their preparations for departure, their movements brisk, businesslike. Some attended to their horses, tethered just beyond the clearing. Others checked their gear. Kenji's body was ignored, left where it had fallen, as insignificant as a discarded stone. Oda stood for a moment, surveying the scene. His duty was done, the fugitive's daughter was secured. The minor resistance had been quelled. Yet, as his gaze fell upon the humble cottage, the neatly stacked firewood, the small, abandoned tools of a simple charcoal burner, a fleeting, unbidden thought crossed his mind. The old man had possessed a strange kind of strength, a stubborn adherence to a principle that Oda, for all his understanding of Bushido's complexities, found unsettlingly pure. It was the strength of conviction, something rarer and perhaps more formidable than the strength of arms. He quickly dismissed the thought. Sentimentality had no place in his world. It was a weakness that could undo a man, a clan, an entire domain. His loyalty was to his lord, his path dictated by duty. That was the only truth that mattered. As the samurai mounted their horses, with Hana placed unceremoniously on a spare pony, her hands bound before her, the clearing began to empty. The forest, which had seemed to hold its breath, slowly began to reclaim its sounds. A bird chirped tentatively, then another. The wind, no longer a lament, rustled through the leaves with its customary indifference. The sun climbed higher, its light illuminating the scene of quiet devastation. The abandoned cottage, the tools scattered where Kenji had dropped them, the dark stain on the earth. The legacy of that morning was one of sorrow and loss. Kenji, the solitary man of peace, was dead, his quiet life brutally ended. Hana, the Ronin's daughter, was a captive, her future uncertain, her young heart burdened with grief and the terrible knowledge of sacrifice. And Captain Oda, the enforcer of a harsh code, rode away, perhaps with a sliver of unease buried deep beneath his armor, a silent question about the nature of true honor that might, or might not, surface in the quiet hours of some future night. The mountain remained, impassive, eternal, its verdant slopes a silent witness to the fleeting, often tragic dramas of human existence. And in the cool, damp earth where Kenji had fallen, a single, unseasonable cherry blossom petal, overlooked by all, slowly began to meld with the soil, a tiny, fragile speck of beauty in a world too often devoid of it, a silent haiku written in the language of sacrifice and sorrow. Silent mountain sleeps, one man's courage, child's tears. Wind whispers his name.